October 14, 1944 to 1,347 hours, 180 miles northwest of Luzon. The kamikaze pilot diving toward the USS Randolph had done everything right. His descent angle, his timing, even his anticipation of the carrier's evasive maneuvers, all calculated to perfection. But what he hadn't accounted for were American shells that no longer needed to hit their targets to destroy them. Exploding within 70 feet of his aircraft, invisible walls of shrapnel shredded through the sky. The Japanese High Command had dismissed earlier intelligence reports about this impossible American weapon as Allied propaganda. Now, they were about to pay the price for that fatal arrogance. As the morning sun stretched long shadows across the Philippine Sea, Admiral Takeo Kurida's Northern Strike Force advanced toward what Tokyo believed would be a decisive blow against the U.S. Navy. For over a year, Japanese pilots had filed strange combat reports, stories of shells bursting with uncanny accuracy, of explosions that seemed to predict their movements. Captured fragments of these shells had been studied by imperial scientists, who confidently concluded the stories were fabrications or hallucinations from combat stress. Now, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, leading the third wave of kamikaze attacks, flew in with the same outdated briefings. His manuals still described American flak as conventional, slow, inaccurate, and easy to outmaneuver. What awaited him that morning was something else entirely, a weapon born not from superstition, but science, the proximity fuse. Shells that detonated only on contact or after a preset delay had been the accepted reality, the backbone of Japanese anti-aircraft assumptions. Attack formations and interception timings were built around those limits. What steamed up from the American cruiser lines that afternoon would vaporize 3 years of doctrine in under 3 minutes. The missing piece, the Japanese High Command could not fathom, was that American engineers had answered a question every gunsmith and tactician had feared: how to make an artillery shell sense the world around it. The classified device called VT was nothing short of revolutionary, a proximity fuse that made a projectile think. Fitted inside a 5-inch shell, it housed a tiny radar transmitter and receiver capable of detecting an aircraft's presence and firing the shell at the precise lethal distance. This was not hypothetical science. By October 1944, U.S. industry was turning out VT fuses by the 100,000, each one containing electronic refinements Japanese scientists believed years away. Admiral Kurida's attack plan, honed by the Imperial Navy's most seasoned tacticians, accounted for every variable except the one that mattered most. Japanese pilots had been trained to exploit predictable gaps in defensive fire, using evasive maneuvers that proved effective against time-fused shells. Their formations and timing were organized around those assumptions. What steamed up from the American cruiser lines that afternoon would undo 3 years of doctrine in under 3 minutes, and that fatal underestimation was about to exact a terrible, transformative price from the Imperial Navy. By late 1944, the strategic picture for U.S. naval forces was razor-thin. Kamikaze strikes, first used systematically during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, had won a terrifying efficacy against conventional defenses. Guns designed to beat conventional bombing runs were poorly suited to stop pilots who accepted death as part of their mission. Pacific Fleet analysts had already begun to reckon with the bleak arithmetic of suicide attacks. Traditional AA gunnery averaged hit rates of only about 3% against diving aircraft, and even successful hits seldom delivered enough kinetic force to halt a fully committed suicide run. Japanese tactics compounded the problem. Attackers came from multiple vectors at once, saturating defensive sectors with sheer numbers and forcing crews to choose which incoming threats to engage. Captain Wesley Harrison of the anti-aircraft cruiser USS Oakland repeatedly logged the same conclusion: existing defensive systems were simply inadequate against this new form of warfare. What was tactical improvisation for some became a strategic crisis for all, and the lessons learned in those brutal minutes would reshape naval air defense for years to come. Captain Harrison's ship, armed with 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns once hailed as cutting-edge in 1942, was now facing their limitations in stark relief. The Oakland's batteries could track only a handful of targets at once. Traditional time-fused shells demanded flawless range calculations and timing, a near impossible task when confronted with swarms of fast, maneuvering aircraft diving from multiple directions. The Japanese had studied these weaknesses with clinical precision. Captured reconnaissance reports revealed detailed analyses of American fire control systems, radar calibration cycles, and reload patterns. Their new tactics exploited the one constant flaw in conventional artillery: predictability. Every American shell either detonated on impact or at a preset moment in flight, creating defensive rhythms that experienced pilots could read, time, and bypass. Imperial Navy training manuals, updated through 18 months of brutal trial and error, now included entire chapters on defeating U.S. flak pilots drilled in timing their dives between salvos, forcing gunners to fire at empty sky, and coordinating simultaneous multi-directional assaults that overwhelmed even the most disciplined crews. By mid-1944, the results were devastating. USS St. Lo went down after a single kamikaze strike. USS Princeton was torn apart when defensive fire failed to intercept an incoming dive bomber. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's operational briefings began to echo a growing anxiety throughout the Pacific Fleet. The enemy's suicidal precision was outpacing America's ability to defend. The implications stretched far beyond individual ships. Amphibious landings depended on uninterrupted naval gunfire support, yet vessels forced into perpetual air defense mode could no longer sustain bombardment for troops ashore. Unless something changed, the very momentum of the Pacific campaign risked grinding to a halt. Choked by the overwhelming efficiency of a desperate enemy, Japanese intelligence had concluded the Americans had reached the limit of defensive technology. Reports from submarine reconnaissance and captured personnel suggested U.S. gunners were already using their best fire control systems, and Japanese scientists reasoned that the physical constraints of conventional artillery left little room for dramatic improvement. That assessment would become Japan's costliest intelligence error of the Pacific War. While imperial tacticians congratulated themselves on devising seemingly unstoppable attack methods, American engineers were quietly inventing a device that would render every assumption about aerial combat obsolete. The solution existed inside secure research facilities, but its mass deployment was still weeks away from the desperate commanders who needed it most. The weapon that would alter naval warfare was born out of a collaboration between Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory and the National Defense Research Committee in the early 1940s. Dr. Merle II, who led the proximity fuse development team, faced an almost impossible engineering problem: build a radar system small and rugged enough to survive the brutal acceleration of gunfire while remaining sensitive enough to detect aircraft at combat ranges. Classified Navy records show just how radical the VT fuse was. Each unit, the 5-inch variant, measured barely 5 inches and weighed roughly 2.1 pounds, yet contained a transmitter, receiver, antenna, and firing circuit. Operating in the 180 to 200 MHz band, it sent continuous radio waves and analyzed reflections to judge a target's proximity. Early testing at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia overcame daunting hurdles. The fuse's vacuum tubes had to survive accelerations exceeding 20,000 g, forces that would instantly destroy ordinary electronics. Engineers solved this with shock-resistant components, novel mounting methods, and ruggedized tube designs. The detection system relied in part on Doppler principles, measuring shifts in reflected frequency to estimate distance and closing speed. When an aircraft entered the optimal kill radius, typically 50 to 70 feet for a 5-inch round, the fuse detonated automatically, producing a fragmentation pattern with a very high chance of crippling or destroying aircraft within the blast zone. Meeting production needs demanded extraordinary industrial coordination. Eastman Kodak turned out the fuse bodies, Sylvania manufactured specialized vacuum tubes, and Western Electric assembled the electronics. By October 1944, American plants were cranking out proximity fuses faster than shells could be ready to carry them, with monthly output already reaching into 6 figures. Quality control protocols engineered at Bell Telephone Laboratories made the fuses astonishingly dependable. Each unit passed 17 separate inspections before leaving the factory: shock resistance trials, frequency checks, sensitivity calibrations, and field reliability climbed above 85%, extraordinary for 1944 electronics. The power problem had been solved too. A miniature battery inside every fuse supplied the radar circuitry for the few seconds between firing and impact, and it armed automatically on firing, so there were no awkward external leads to complicate ammunition handling. Secrecy around the program was absolute. Even shipboard gunnery officers were given only the barest guidance on employment. Rounds arrived in sealed containers with explicit orders to recover or destroy any duds to deny the enemy a chance at reverse engineering. Japanese technicians who later examined fragments noted unfamiliar electronic parts but wrote them off as crude guidance components, convinced that vacuum tube limits and power constraints made true miniaturized radar impossible. That misreading of American capability would prove catastrophic once VT fuses hit the line. October 14, 1944, 1,400 hours. The first combat use of proximity fuses came during a moment when American naval forces could least afford a surprise. Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 38 was preparing to meet what would become the largest coordinated kamikaze strike of the campaign. Captain Robert Anders of the USS Stockton, who had received the classified ammunition only 3 days earlier under the strictest security, was authorized to employ it. The attacking force approached in the familiar pattern that had wreaked havoc all year. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura led some 120 aircraft in a mass dive designed to exploit known reload intervals in American 5-inch batteries. Their plan relied on the predictability of time-fused shells: wait for gunners to fire, then strike in the vulnerable seconds while crews reloaded. At 14:03, the Stockton's forward battery tracked the raid on fire control radar at 18,000 yards but held its fire until the targets closed to about 12,000 yards, standard practice to ensure time-fused rounds would burst in effective zones. What followed shattered assumptions. Instead of predictable salvos in empty intervals, the American bursts began to bloom at optimal lethal ranges automatically, transforming defensive belts into dense, lethal barriers that no pilot had been trained to expect. In those frantic minutes, the new fuse's advantages were plain: more aircraft were shredded by airbursts before reaching the ships, gunners could engage more threats effectively, and the psychological edge shifted. What had been a calculated gamble by desperate attackers became, for them, an unfolding catastrophe, and for American commanders, the first proof that a tiny, secret device could change the face of naval air defense forever. The first proximity-fused shell detonated 67 feet from Lieutenant Nakamura's aircraft at 14:04:15. The explosion blossomed in empty sky, no visible hit, no tracer contact, leaving both American gunners and Japanese pilots momentarily baffled. Seconds later, Nakamura's plane erupted into fragments, torn apart by invisible shrapnel. The pilot died instantly, struck by steel splinters that pierced the cockpit from seemingly impossible angles. USS Stockton's gunnery logs recorded results unlike anything seen before. The opening salvo of 12 proximity-fused shells destroyed 4 enemy aircraft, a 33% kill rate, exceeding by tenfold what conventional fire control systems could ever achieve. The Japanese formations, expecting to exploit gaps between timed bursts, instead found themselves flying through unseen walls of lethal fragments stretching far beyond known defensive ranges. Radio intercepts from the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, captured the chaos. Japanese pilots transmitted frantic messages: asterisk shells exploding midair, no hits, aircraft breaking apart. Asterisk the confusion and panic spread through the attacking waves, confirming that the weapon's psychological shock was as devastating as its physical effect. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, serving as Air Defense Coordinator aboard USS Birmingham, later described the encounter in his after-action report. Enemy aircraft approached using standard kamikaze tactics. Our proximity fuses created overlapping kill zones that rendered further attacks impossible. 12 enemy aircraft destroyed. 0 American casualties. In less than 10 minutes, the most feared tactic of the Pacific War, the kamikaze dive, had met a defense it could neither predict nor overcome. The age of intelligent artillery had begun. The mathematical advantage was absolute. Traditional anti-aircraft fire depended on either a direct hit or a perfectly timed detonation. The proximity fuse changed that equation entirely. Each shell now produced a spherical kill zone, hundreds of times larger than before. Japanese pilots, trained to dodge single points of impact, suddenly faced invisible volumes of death they could not outmaneuver. By 1430 hours, Admiral Toyoda's Northern Strike Force had lost 63 aircraft to proximity-fused fire. Not a single kamikaze reached its target. American intelligence monitoring Japanese radio channels recorded growing panic among the remaining pilots, who described what they believed were supernatural defenses. The tactical revolution was complete. The proximity fuse had turned anti-aircraft warfare from a contest of precision into one of area denial. The kamikaze strategy, designed to exploit human reaction time and conventional timing gaps, was rendered obsolete. What had once been a terrifyingly effective weapon of sacrifice was now suicide with no chance of success. Yet the psychological effect ran even deeper than the physical destruction. Japanese pilots who had faced death with calm resolve now found themselves fighting an unseen, incomprehensible enemy, a weapon that killed without visible cause or warning. One of the few survivors, squadron leader Yoshio Tanaka, described the experience in post-war interrogations. "We approached as we had dozens of times before. Our formations were perfect. Our timing exact. Then aircraft began exploding in empty air. No shells struck them directly. No pattern made sense. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us." Tanaka's testimony, echoed by other survivors, illustrated a total collapse of tactical confidence among pilots once regarded as fearless. But within the Japanese command structure, reports of impossible American defenses were dismissed as signs of fatigue or delusion. Captain Minoru Genda, Chief Operations Officer for Admiral Ozawa's carrier force, concluded in his intelligence assessment that proximity detonations were physically impossible given the known limits of 1940s electronics. That single misjudgment, the refusal to believe what was already unfolding in the skies, compounded the disaster. Japan's air arm had not merely lost aircraft, it had lost faith, and with it, the Initiative .by November 1944, captured Japanese records exposed a spreading collapse of morale among kamikaze units. Pilots who had once volunteered eagerly for suicide missions were now requesting reassignment. The psychological foundation of the tactic, the acceptance of certain death in exchange for guaranteed success, had disintegrated. Missions were still certain death, but now with no chance of success. American naval reports noted dramatic changes in enemy behavior. Admiral Raymond Spruance, in his November operations summary, observed that Japanese aircraft increasingly avoided engagement altogether, refusing to press attacks even when opportunities seemed favorable. It marked a total reversal of imperial doctrine, which for years had exalted aggression and self-sacrifice regardless of the odds. The consequences rippled throughout Japan's high command. As losses mounted without inflicting comparable damage, Imperial Navy headquarters began to question the very principles of its defensive warfare strategy. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Army Chief of Staff, received alarming intelligence briefings suggesting that American science had achieved capabilities beyond present comprehension. Medical files from Japanese naval hospitals painted an even darker picture. Surviving pilots increasingly suffered acute combat stress, but of a new kind. These were not men haunted by death, but by futility. They described fighting an unseen enemy, a weapon that struck without warning or logic. Navy psychiatrists, unprepared for this new psychological trauma, struggled to treat aviators who spoke of fighting ghosts and barriers in the sky. The intense secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse magnified its psychological power. Japanese intelligence, unable to recover an intact device, drifted into wild speculation. Reports circulated of magnetic fields that detected aircraft, or radar-guided bullets that tracked targets through the air, all far removed from the truth. Recognizing this growing confusion, American psychological warfare specialists seized the opportunity. Propaganda broadcasts aimed at Japanese forces began to speak of invisible defensive barriers and automatic sky mines that made attacks suicidal. The difference this time was that the propaganda was rooted in fact. The results were devastating. A weapon born from pure engineering had evolved into a force of psychological dominance, eroding not just Japan's air power, but the very will of its pilots to fight. By December 1944, the broader strategic consequences of the proximity fuse were undeniable. Japanese naval aviation, the same force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor and once ruled the Pacific skies, had effectively ceased offensive operations against the U.S. Navy. A weapon that killed through proximity had also created a psychological distance that Japan's airmen could no longer cross. The impact of the proximity fuse reached far beyond the end of the Pacific War. Military analysts from every major nation studied how this single innovation had neutralized Japan's kamikaze strategy, transforming the mathematics of aerial warfare. It proved that technological superiority could decisively overcome both numerical strength and tactical ingenuity when the gap in capability became vast enough. Post-war interrogations underscored the weapon's significance. Admiral Toyoda, former commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, admitted, "The proximity fuse rendered our aviation tactics obsolete overnight." On the American side, General Curtis LeMay observed that the technology had saved thousands of lives, ending the kamikaze threat without the need for a costly invasion of Japan. The industrial achievement behind the weapon was equally transformative. By war's end, the United States had produced over 22 million proximity fuses, a feat Japan's wartime industry could never have matched. Each fuse represented a seamless fusion of academic research, private industry innovation, and military engineering, a collaboration that would become the blueprint for post-war defense science. In his 1945 final report, Dr. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, summarized the achievement. The proximity fuse exemplified how scientific research, properly organized, can be converted into decisive military power. It proved that complex electronics could be mass-produced and perform flawlessly in the most demanding combat conditions. The proximity fuse was more than a weapon, it was a turning point. It marked the dawn of a new era in warfare where science, not numbers, decided victory. The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond World War II, shaping military doctrine for generations. During the Cold War, NATO forces designed proximity-fused surface-to-air missiles that directly evolved from the pioneering principles established in 1944. Even today, modern air defense systems still rely on proximity detection, now powered by digital processors instead of vacuum tubes, yet the core idea remains unchanged, creating lethal kill zones around projectiles rather than depending on direct hits. This concept continues to define the architecture of contemporary anti-aircraft and missile defense technology worldwide. The historical and educational impact also endures. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History preserves original proximity fuses alongside recorded testimonies from both American engineers and Japanese airmen who witnessed their effects. These exhibits stand as powerful reminders that technological innovation can resolve tactical stalemates where brute force alone could not, and that intelligence, more than firepower, can alter the course of war. Contemporary military historians regard the proximity fuse as a watershed in the evolution of modern warfare. Professor John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University observed that this invention proved how industrial power combined with scientific innovation could surpass even the most time-honored military virtues of courage and tactical brilliance. Its success continues to fuel debate among military ethicists. The fuse's ability to save countless American lives while annihilating Japanese air power underscores the moral paradox of technological warfare. Some scholars argue that such breakthroughs shorten wars and reduce overall suffering, while others contend that technological supremacy creates an imbalance, turning battlefields into demonstrations of science rather than courage. Modern precision-guided weapons trace their origins directly to this 1940s innovation. GPS-guided artillery shells, radar homing missiles, and automated air defense systems all employ proximity detection principles first proven in combat during World War II. Moreover, the miniaturization methods developed to make the fuse's tiny vacuum tube circuits function under extreme conditions later became the foundation for transistors, and ultimately, the microprocessor revolution that defines today's digital age. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as enduring proof of the proximity fuse's transformative power. It was there that Japanese kamikaze tactics met the invisible precision of American electronics, signaling the end of Japan's naval aviation dominance. In October 1944, flame cleared the caves of Iwo Jima. By December, invisible waves of radar had cleared the skies over the Pacific. The lesson remains timeless. In modern warfare, victory belongs not merely to those with courage or numbers, but to those who master the science that defines the battlefield.